Dying before we've even started.
I know. Thank you so much for having us. So, I'm Xavier. I am a producer and a reporter at Tortoise working on our podcasts. This is Dave, who can sort of introduce himself.
I work at Tortoise as well, where most of our journalism is around investigative podcasts. We do newsletters as well and live events similar to this, except without the roast beef, I think. We have a number of strands of our podcast, don't we, that go after big stories like the Sacklers.
Yeah, so a few weeks ago we released a podcast about the Sacklers, and it was basically, lots of us know to some degree the story of the Sacklers. We've seen Dope Sick, we might have read Empire of Pain. I think what's been in the news less is the legal fights and the Supreme Court fights, which the Sacklers have been part of in the past few years. And it's a very pertinent fight when it comes to understanding to what extent the Sacklers will face any sort of accountability. And so we made a podcast about that. So we are going to be talking about that podcast, but about the Sacklers more generally. And we'll leave a few minutes for questions at the end. So please do be patient if you have anything you're burning to ask. Yeah, of course. So let's start with the podcast. So there was a bit at the start of the podcast where there was a lawmaker saying, "I'm not sure of any family in America that is more evil than yours." And that was directed towards the Sacklers. So, many people know the bare bones of this story, but just in a couple of minutes, why don't you just tell us how the Sacklers became so hated in America?
Sure. So, there was three brothers who founded a company called Purdue Pharma that had a very successful cancer drug, but really wanted a share of a much bigger market for everyday painkillers. And so in the mid-90s, in 96, they launched a drug called OxyContin, which, suddenly took America by storm. It was used for, the everyday pain that people had through work injuries, even sort of dental surgery. And the marketing of it was very aggressive. It was, a lot of prescribers were absolutely courted by aggressive salesmen who wouldn't really talk about the potential risks that this opioid presented, and they very much sort of relied on, flaky research to sort of give it the clean bill of health. And it rapidly started to change towns and cities across America because people became addicted to it, and with it came the associated problems of families breaking up and addiction and crime. And it was only really a few years down the line that I suppose law enforcement began to pay attention. And even when it became obvious that this drug was becoming a scourge and was the Sacklers back at base were hearing from their salespeople that when doctors are pushing back and telling us that this is like the drug of choice on the streets, they persisted with an aggressive marketing program to try and bump profits up. And so it became, in a way, well, you've probably seen Dope Sick and seen how it ravaged communities. But the thing that was grabbing us, I suppose, was this idea that, Dope Sick kind of ends with an accountability moment where there's a prosecution and a multi-million-dollar fine. But that was actually in sort of May 2007, and no one's really followed through what happened after that. So that was where we were focused.
Yeah, so why don't we turn to that date, so 17th of May 2007, that's when our podcast really starts. Yes, so why don't you lay out what's happening on that day?
Yeah, we really get going on this date in May. And I mean, the great thing about this from a journalist's point of view is that because there's been so much litigation aimed at Purdue and the Sacklers, there's an awful lot of documentary evidence now in the public domain. So you can see the emails that are going back and forth. You can see the presentations that went to board meetings and be aware of who was there and how it went down. But the reason we focused on that date was because it felt like the sort of moment of maximum jeopardy, really, for the Sacklers. You know, they'd just the company had pleaded guilty to 3 felony charges about misleading the whole marketplace, including regulators, and then. You know, you see this email traffic going on where one member of the family is saying, oh, well, you know, all my friends are saying, you're rich now, but, you know, you don't want to become poor. And suddenly you see the family talking to one another saying, rich, but for how long? What the hell do you think's going on in these courtrooms? And we've got to do something about it. So they, essentially, over 10 years, they pull $11 billion out of the company, and most of it goes offshore into a sort of collection of, you know, trusts that you can't really sort of report on. And yeah, the upshot is that even while they're under the scrutiny of the federal government, their books are supposed to be open to you know, prosecutors potentially. They're just pulling this money out so they can get it away from the risk of lawsuits, which surely come.
And meanwhile, they are continuing to push OxyContin.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like one of the most dispiriting, miserable things about this whole story is not really the, you know, like the venal, profit-driven motive of the Sackler family. In my view, it's when the consultants get called in and McKinsey come in, you know, one of these big companies, and the Sacklers are looking at this situation where profits are starting to go down because the drug has become harder to misuse and law enforcement is watching them. And so they bring McKinsey in, and McKinsey have this brilliant scheme that they present to a board meeting, which is only Sackler family members present. And they tell them that they've got this scheme called turbocharging the sales engine. And the way they do it is they say, you do realize, don't you, that like 50% of the prescriptions for OxyContin are made by 7% of prescribers. So if you target those guys, your profits will go up. And they come out of this meeting and they're emailing each other saying, it's amazing what McKinsey's discovered, and you know, we're all for this. And they aggressively push for more, even while they know this drug is really causing problems.
And it does feel, as we sort of laid out the timeline in the podcast, you know, it's a bit of an emotional roller coaster in terms of moments in which the Sacklers seem like they're facing accountability, and then different moments where it feels like they're getting away. So there's this moment in 2018 with the Massachusetts Attorney General, and that feels like another big moment in this story. Yeah. So why don't you just explain what that sets off? So
in 2007, they're panicking in their emails to each other, and they're saying, you know, we've got to get the money out because they're going to come after us. And then you see over the next decade lawsuits piling up. There's thousands of them across America. And it all changes in 2018, where this one case names the Sackler family for the first time. And it makes it personal, and everything that they were saying in 2007 becomes true in 2018, and it changes the whole dynamic, because suddenly all of these lawsuits look like they might come after their money. And so what they do is Purdue Pharma immediately pretty much declares bankruptcy, and so all the cases stop, and it's then a question of like, how much money is there, can you get it, who can you do a deal with? And you get this wild, ugly scene, don't you, with the politics of it all. Because if you imagine, there's 50 states, there are cities that are suing them, there are hospitals that are suing them, Native American tribes, there are 140,000 victims and families, and they've all got their own agendas, and they all want compensation. And some of the Democratic states want an apology. Some of them want them barred from ever being in Big Pharma again. Others just want the money. And so it goes on. So you get the reason that we're really fixating on the US Supreme Court right now is that there is a huge decision that's about to come, and it all stems from that moment where they declare bankruptcy.
And before we get to the Supreme Court, obviously, you know, when you're making a podcast, you really want to make sure that there's a compelling story and that there's compelling characters. And I think it's, you know, we shouldn't forget that although the story of the Sacklers in recent years has become very legalistic because it's playing out in the Supreme Court, there are humans and human cost at the heart of it. So we interviewed this amazing woman called Cheryl, who really is a victim, is a survivor of this epidemic, and has become a real warrior in terms of accountability. So why don't you tell the audience a little about Cheryl and how she factors into the story and when she came into the legal fight?
Yeah, so she starts, she's a mother, she's got 3 boys. When they grow up, one of them becomes a cop, and the other 2 go in quite a different direction. The youngest one has a hernia operation while he's in high school and gets painkillers and becomes addicted. And his path is a very difficult one. And it sort of mirrors everything that happened nationally in the US, where, you know, there's a realization that prescription drugs are causing strife and addiction. So it becomes harder to misuse them. People who are addicted, and there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of them, are moved towards the illegal market. So heroin becomes the driver of the next wave of the opioid epidemic. And as you probably know, we're now in a different phase where fentanyl, the synthetic drug, is the one that's really driving addiction and is so easy to overdose on. And, you know, her family pretty much went through that whole scenario. Her youngest son was overdosed and killed himself with heroin, having become addicted. And, you know, Cheryl has this moment where she sees that Massachusetts case where the Sacklers are named, and she's from that area, and she suddenly realizes that my story is this story. These guys caused this. And so she becomes an activist, starts picketing Purdue Pharma's headquarters, and gets hundreds of similar parents together, sets up a kind of national organization, and ultimately becomes part of this bankruptcy case representing the interests of all these tens of thousands of families. But it just takes so very long, doesn't it? And her story kind of weaves through the podcast as you're inching along towards, you know, maybe a measure of justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think we interviewed one of the lawyers arguing for the bankruptcy deal, standing in the Supreme Court, and I think he said in the podcast that since that 2018 lawsuit, 216,000 people have died from opioid related overdoses or opioid related deaths. Taking us up to date now to this Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So in 2019, with the Sacklers having pulled a lot of their money out of Purdue Pharma declares bankruptcy. And so in the Supreme Court, what is being adjudicated on is a bankruptcy deal. And so can you just lay out what the stakes are and what will happen if the deal stands and what will happen if it falls in the Supreme Court?
So if you're anything like me, there's a brilliant resource called SCOTUS blog in the US, which is the acronym for the Supreme Court. And in this month of June, you know, they've had their session where they've heard 30-odd cases in the course of the year, and they come with their opinions in June, and they just come in a rush as June runs out. And it's so arcane that you don't know which decisions are coming. You get a heads up 24 hours that there's going to be some boxes on Thursday, and you don't know how many cases there are going to be or which ones there'll be. And everyone responds very rapidly. So we've been watching very closely. It hasn't come yet. It could come this coming week, and it certainly should come before the end of June. And the gist of it is that a bankruptcy court judge agreed a settlement where the Sackler family would actually put up $6 billion of their own money in compensation, and the company, they'd have to get out of the pharma business. The company would become a non-profit, having declared bankruptcy, and all of this money would go directly to what they call abatement of the opioid crisis, so for recovery and prevention and treatment. And for the first time, hundreds of millions of dollars would actually go to victims of the crisis. And everybody gradually got in line behind this deal. First of all, there was loads of Democrat states that didn't like it. Then they got on board, they bumped the money up a bit. And we've got to the doors of the Supreme Court, and the only entity that is now against the deal is Joe Biden's Department of Justice. And the kind of ugly politics of it is that this deal was first announced with about 3 weeks of the Trump administration still to go. And, they trumpeted it as an amazing victory. And the Biden administration has found itself in this kind of knotty bit of politics where you think, well, hang on a minute, are we going to be on the side of billionaires doing a deal? Do we really want that? And they have fought the case because they say the company might have declared bankruptcy, but the Sacklers haven't. But the Sacklers are going to get this major immunity that comes from the deal. So they pony up $6 billion, and in return, no one can ever sue them anywhere in the world ever again. And people say, where's the justice in that? So you find yourself, I can see people shaking their heads and going, oh my God, that's so terrible. And you go through this thing, this can't be right. How can they get away with it? Which is really the sort of subtext of our podcast, asking that question. But you start to develop a pragmatism as you cover this story, and you think, well, hang on a minute, is the best answer to get the money, use it for treatment, and move on? And that's the fight where you've got families and everybody else over here saying, we want the money, and the government, for some quite predictable political reasons, saying, oh no, the bankruptcy court judge has acted outside of his powers and this can't stand. So it sounds really technical, and it's about the nuance of a bankruptcy deal, but hanging in the balance is whether or not hundreds of thousands of people are ever going to be compensated, and whether the Sacklers will ever pay up. Because if the deal falls, it's back to square one, and the chances of the Sacklers bringing their money back on shore, you don't like it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. When we talked to Eric Price, a bankruptcy lawyer, he said that 95% of victims and victims' families supported the settlement agreement. So even though in many ways it sounds like a lousy agreement, I think for lots of victims and families, they've been waiting for so long, and it really feels like it might be back to square one if it falls. And I guess, just to be clear, the Sacklers would be immune from civil prosecution if the settlement stands. They wouldn't be immune from criminal prosecution.
Yeah, and that's another, you look at this case and you think, well, the moral failure of the Sacklers is there for all to see, but there have been terrible failures in public life, really. The regulation system utterly failed in allowing OxyContin to come to market in the way it did. This spans the administrations from Bush through Obama, through Trump onto Biden, and the DOJ has been absolutely disastrous throughout that. They could have brought the Sacklers to book. They certainly could have prosecuted them criminally, but seemingly chose not to. It would still be open to them to do it, but no one's holding their breath. But yes, you're right that most of the victims say, look, we just want the money. This guy, this bankruptcy lawyer, had this amazing line where he said, I hear from some people, I don't care if it takes 10 years, I want every dime from the Sacklers. And then there are others, he said, like the vast majority of people he spoke to, he said, I don't care if it's the Sacklers or the Schmacklers, I just want my money and I want to move on. And I think that was where we sort of netted out.
And so we are now awaiting that decision. Do we have any sense of how the Supreme Court will land on this?
I mean, there are people close to it who have said that they think, there's 9 justices and they think it's a 5-4 split and they think it could go either way. But then, this week there was a huge decision about abortion, and it was about whether an abortion pill could stay on the market. And, we all know how conservative and Catholic skewed the Supreme Court is right now, but they voted 9-0 in favor of retaining that. So I think in some ways it's quite hard to predict the scoreline, but, we all like to do it. So 5-4 to somebody is the prediction.
Just a couple more questions before we open up to the room. So if you do have any questions, please stick your hands up in a few minutes. So there was another element to this podcast, which is that lots of us, our access point to the Sackler story was seeing the waves of protests in museums and institutions around the world. So in, I think, 2018 and 2019 especially, Nan Goldin, the artist, led these amazing protests in the Guggenheim and the Met. And obviously, the focus of a lot of those protests was museums and other institutions, their relationship with the Sacklers, the way in which they use the Sackler name, and obviously the kind of crux of the protest was to say you shouldn't be associating yourself with this family. And so, that was 2018, 2019. We're now here in 2024. If you take a look around London today, where and how do you see the Sackler name still?
Yeah, well, I know you lot like a walk, so you could have a go at a thing that we did, which is like a dark tourist trail, the Sackler tour of London. And we went one day a couple of months ago we started at the Serpentine in Hyde Park, which used to have the Sackler name on its facade. And if you've ever slightly tried to sort of botch job a plaster over a hole in your bedroom or something, you'll get the idea that it's really obvious where it was. There's like all these holes in the sandstone where Sackler's been ripped off. And so you think, oh, well, at least they've done it. It's a bit rubbish, but they've done it. But then there's a huge glass plinth that stands right at the entrance with like a sort of like a Hall of Fame list of benefactors, and top billing goes to the Sacklers, and it's still there outside the building. We went to Tate Modern, and their name's still there on the glass wall in the Turbine Hall, even though it's been sort of slightly levered off the elevators and the escalators. But then the really mind-blowing thing is when you go to Westminster Abbey, there's a stained glass window dedicated to the Sacklers, and it's in Henry VII's Lady Chapel, which is like, if you watched any of the coronation, it's just behind where that happened. And it's, last resting place of sort of 15 monarchs, and there's the Sackler name up in the corner, and they paid them £600,000, I think, towards some restoration work. And the Abbey, when we asked them about it, said, well, we don't take their money anymore, we're not talking to them anymore, but we've got no plans to have that removed. And it just left us thinking, like, well, what would it take? I mean, it's not like a sort of ancient artifact that's there. And you sort of ask yourself the question as a visitor, does it cost you actually more to keep it reputationally than it would to put a new one in? It's really, really sobering, and I think a lot of people don't realize it's there.
Yeah, no, really.